and start. So Cassidy and I, we decided to do some research on gender, schema, and politics, and we really wanted to take a cognitive approach to this study. So let's just jump right in. So the purpose of our study, Cassidy and I are both very interested in gender and politics, specifically how women still struggle to have their voices heard in the political arena today. Women make up only 23.2% of the House of Representatives and 26% of the Senate here in the United States. While this has been increasing over the past few decades, this is still lower if you consider what proportional representation should look like. So why is it that women still face these obstacles to being elected to public office and having their voices heard? We really wanted to answer this question. So with this in mind, we really wanted to approach this issue from a gender schematic approach. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to Cassidy so she can kind of explain what schema really are.
So schema are information processing structures that simplify daily cognition. You've been developing these since childhood, and you continue to work on them as you grow older. So an example I like to give is you usually have a structure to your daily morning, and if that includes getting a cup of coffee, you know you might have to wait in line. You approach the cashier, tell them what you want, and then pay for your order, and then you go and wait for your coffee to be delivered. This is what you expect to happen on the daily. Now, when we think about schema and the way it's applied to gender, what we think is like, this is what I expect from a man, or this is what I expect from a woman. So for example, if I meet a recently married woman, I might assume she wants children someday. I actually don't know that, but from my own personal experience, that might be what I expect. It's largely a result of what we've been taught through socialization and through our parental figures. Another example I like to give is my co-presenter, Zach, is quite tall. You can't tell, but he's quite a tall guy. And when I first met him, I thought, he's probably an athlete. He's a man. He's very tall. Although I would have guessed he would have played basketball, not bowling. So that's a way we can think of how our gender schema influences us every day. Another thing you should know, you depend less on your schema the more you get to know someone. So now that I know Zach, I know that he's into bowling, not basketball. So when we were thinking about schema, we wanted to apply it to our experiment. And some previous literature on gender schema has shown that we do tend to project our schema on other individuals. A really interesting piece talked about advertising. There were different masculine and feminine characters featured in advertisements, and people would judge what they thought of their masculinity and femininity. One that I found really interesting was there was a popsicle advertisement, and the father displayed in the popsicle advertisement was this like early Boston accented man, and people found him less masculine than other characters because he was talking about popsicles for his children. So as we were examining the literature, we found that not a lot had been done in evaluating masculinity and femininity of politicians themselves, but we do know that women are seen as less credible than their male counterparts in politics, which we thought maybe relates back to their gender. So we decided to create a 3x2x2 experiment where we took two issues that have previously been seen as gendered. Terrorism is usually seen as a masculine type of issue, where education, because it's more nurturing and it deals with children, has typically been seen as traditionally feminine. So what we decided to do is we found two speeches on C-SPAN that were pretty nonpartisan in talking about terrorism and education. We took the transcripts from that, and then we assigned whether or not a male speaker, a female speaker, or just an unidentified speaker said these topics to give an idea of, okay, I have this male or female giving a speech on terrorism or education. There were several participants. We ended up using 326 of the surveys, and it's important to know that each participant was randomly assigned to one of these conditions.
All right, so now that we've talked a little bit more about our methodology, I'm going to give us a little bit more information about the transcripts that we actually selected. So like Cassidy already kind of pointed out, transcripts were chosen based on the content being as nonpartisan as possible. So one thing that we really wanted to do with this experiment is that we really wanted to try to hone in on the gender part of this. We only wanted to activate gender. So that's why we decided to do transcripts instead of actually doing video content. We thought that with video content, there would be too many variables for us to control, and we still thought that we could get a reasonable size effect from just having transcripts. So for each treatment, the politicians were giving identifying pronouns and names to serve as a cue for gender schema activation. So an example of this, what we did was the male name was Mr. Secretary Mark Brown, The female name was Madam Secretary Susan Brown, and for the unidentified treatment, the name was simply Secretary Brown with no accompanying pronouns. So then an example of how we activated this, these gender schema before the actual transcript was, we would say this is just an example of one of the 6 conditions we had, but it was Madam Secretary Susan Brown was asked to give her remarks on the issue of terrorism. So that was pretty simple, and that's pretty much all we said there. So now let's look at a couple of quick clips of the transcripts that we actually selected. So the first one here is a video of Betsy DeVos basically just sharing some facts about education.
And I'll add communities and parents. Yet over the past 40 years, federal taxpayer spending on education has increased about 180%, amounting to over $1.2 trillion cumulatively. And we're still 24th in reading, 25th in science, and 40th in math when compared to the rest of the world. Doing the same thing.
She is obviously a fairly partisan politician. The actual content of her message was quite nonpartisan in nature. It was mostly very, very factual. And this is just a very small snippet of the transcript. And so for our second one, this one was about terrorism. This one is more of a roundtable discussion, but the actual content, again, is very factual based and just very content focused, not very partisan in nature.
The nature of the threat in the period since 9/11. I think it's fair to say that in the period right after 9/11, certainly for the first several years, we were very al-Qaeda focused. That's not surprising. That was the terrorism threat that was most proximate to the United States. It's certainly, in terms of the homeland, what we were the most concerned about. And we still are very much in our mind in those early days had a model in mind of an organization that was trying to penetrate the United States.
Very content focused, very historically based, you know, using a lot of facts. So this is why these transcripts were chosen for this study. Okay, so now let's just jump right into our hypotheses and go over the actually what we predicted for this study. So hypothesis 1 is that speakers who are speaking on the issue of terrorism will be rated higher for masculinity than the speakers who are speaking on the issue of education. So if we look over at our first table here, I'm just going to go over the top left quadrant and then the bottom right quadrant. So it's color coded so you guys can kind of see what we were expecting here. So again, the male speaker talking about terrorism, we're expecting that to be the highest rating for masculinity. And then for the bottom right, where a female speaker is talking about education, that's where we're expecting the lowest rating for masculinity. Because again, females talking about a very female, traditionally females or feminine subject, we would expect to be lower rated for masculinity. Now for our next hypothesis, this is basically just the inverse of our last hypothesis. So this is speakers who are speaking on the issue of education instead of terrorism will be rated higher for femininity than the speakers who are speaking on the issue of terrorism. So, you know, this one's really focusing on femininity, not masculinity. So again, this is just kind of the inverse of our last hypothesis. So male speakers talking about terrorism will be lowest rated for femininity, whereas the female speakers talking about education will be the highest rated for femininity. So again, these are just kind of the inverse of each other.
In order to understand our next few hypotheses, you need to know what the BEM sex role inventory is. We use this measurement to understand how gender schematic processing may be taking place. So we gave this to our participants themselves and had them use this to evaluate the politicians on the transcripts. So what this does is it is 10 masculine items, 10 feminine items, and 10 neutral items. And participants would rank the applicability of these items on a 7-point scale. Some example terms that were used were like aggressive, was this person warm, are they competitive? And then an EFA was conducted originally to determine what kind of items fell in masculine, feminine, and neutral items. If an individual is sex type, then they're considered to match their sex in terms of their gender in a traditional sense. So if you are a man and you are typed as very masculine, you would fall under the sex type category. If you're a female, then very feminine. Androgynous means that you show both masculine and feminine traits. And then cross-sex type is the opposite. So if you were cross-sex type, and a man, then you would show more strength in the feminine features.
And we also used a credibility measure to measure the credibility of the speakers. So this credibility measure, using dichotomous terms, it measured 3 different factors of credibility. So it wasn't just one overarching factor of credibility, it was 3 different ones. So there was a competence factor. Basically, they asked them, are they intelligent or are they unintelligent? It also measured a caring or goodwill factor, which is they care about me or they don't care about me. And then there was a trustworthiness factor, which was an example that would be honest versus dishonest. And participants were asked to choose a value on the scale from 1 to 7 for each item. So for example, a 1 would be they are very honest, or a 7 would be they are very dishonest. So now let's talk about the rest of our hypotheses for this study. So hypothesis 3, these are very moderation-based hypotheses here. Participants who score higher on the BSRI for masculinity will rate the female speakers as less credible than the female speakers. And then hypothesis 4, participants who score higher on the BSRI for femininity will rate the female speakers as more credible than participants who score higher on the BSRI for masculinity. So really what we're doing here is we're comparing participants' own personal scores on the BSRI to their scores for the speakers. And lastly, our last 2 hypotheses, we also just wanted to see possibly what demographics could predict scores on the BSRI. So these hypotheses, hypothesis 5 reads, party identification will be the strongest predictor of the BSRI evaluations of the speakers for femininity. And then hypothesis 6 is basically the same, just for masculinity. Party identification will be the strongest predictor of BSRI evaluations of the speakers for masculinity. So we're really expecting party identification here to be a really strong predictor for both femininity and masculinity. So now let's just go right into our results. So for hypothesis 1, again, we're talking about terrorism being rated higher for masculinity than the speakers who are talking about education. We really only got one significant result for this one-way ANOVA that we conducted here. The one significant result here we got was an interaction effect between speaker gender and the sex of the participant. So what we observed happening here is that the female participants, they rated the unidentified and the male speakers as being more masculine than the female speakers. We expected that to happen, but our treatment effect overall did not have an effect. So because of that, we could not support our first hypothesis. In addition, hypothesis 2, after seeing the results for hypothesis 1, we kind of expected that we wouldn't have a treatment effect for hypothesis 2 either, and that is what we saw. We also didn't get any significant main effects or interactions for hypothesis 2 for this one-way ANOVA we did here, so we were also not able to support this hypothesis either. Now going into hypotheses 3 and 4, this is when we started to look a little bit more into credibility. So for both of these hypotheses, we performed moderation analyses using Hayes's process and SPSS. However, we found no significant moderators, leading to no support for both of these hypotheses. So our first 4 hypotheses, we didn't really find any significant results except for that one significant interaction effect in the first hypothesis. But now going into hypotheses 5 and 6 is when we start to see some more significance arising. So here we really wanted to see what the factors that predict perceptions of femininity for the speakers were. So as we kind of predicted in this hypothesis, party identification was a significant predictor for femininity for the speakers, as was marriage status. We did not predict this, but this was an interesting finding that we found here. Some of the other demographics that we also tested for, such as education level, sex, and sexual orientation, were not found to be significant. And then this carried over to testing for the masculinity of the speakers. We also found significance for party identification and marriage status here. And again, marriage status was slightly stronger of a predictor than party identification. However, because party identification was a very strong predictor, we were able to support hypotheses 5 and 6. So now let's dive in and talk a little bit about what this means. So we didn't find support for hypotheses 1 to 4, but we did find support for hypotheses 5 and 6. So you're probably thinking to yourselves, well, this is a very, very large experiment for for a treatment to not really have an effect. So it might seem like a negative that we didn't find any, we didn't actually support our treatment effect, like our hypotheses for that. However, I think this could actually be seen as a positive, right? Really the argument that we could make here is that in a text-based kind of field where we're reading about something, maybe in a newspaper article, and they're talking about the gender of someone, we might not actually use gender schematic thinking and use our own gender stereotypes when we're thinking about that. So this could actually be seen as a positive. So now let's dive a little bit more into the analysis for hypotheses 5 and 6. So first, what we see is that our data shows that those who identify as a Republican are more likely to engage in gender schematic processing than those who identify as a Democrat. So really what we think this comes down to is the platforms of both parties and really what they preach a lot of the time. Now, Cassidy will tell us a little bit more about what the marriage means.
So in thinking about those who are married are more likely to engage in gender schematic processing, a large reason why we thought that might be the case is because you have this other individual that you see all the time and you get set in your patterns. So you've maybe taken on certain roles in order to balance out your relationship. And because that's your main experience with an individual of the opposite sex, then you take your experience and then cast it on to the other politicians. Another thing we note in our discussion is that when we took the BSRI and did our own factor analysis, we had a lot of cross-loading on items, which might indicate that we need a new scale in order to understand gender schematic thinking. While the scale is still used in studies as recent as like 2017, 2018, it just might not be as applicable as it once was, which is part of our limitations. Looking at some of our other limitations, some issues we also have is we wonder if the treatment was just not strong enough. We think that using a video stimulus in the future would be better, but as Zach mentioned before, when you get into video, there's lots of different issues. So for example, the way we dress the politicians may matter. Like, does it matter if a woman is wearing a pink skirt pantsuit versus a navy pantsuit? Like, could this cause gender schematic thinking automatically? And then we've also thought that gender schematic processing may be different between cultural groups, and that could warrant future research as well. And that would be a great avenue for future research. Thank you.
And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you, Zach and Cassidy. Joining us now is our Panel D discussant, Amber Lasvardi. Amber is a PhD candidate in political science at Purdue University. She studies political communication, gender, and politics. Amber is originally from Mattoon, Illinois, home of Bagel Fest. When she travels, she tries to visit unique lighthouses. She especially likes the black and white lighthouses. Welcome, Amber Lasvardi.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Zach and Cassidy, for this paper. I think the C-SPAN archives are a great way to study the intersections of policy and gender, especially when we think of the gendered nature of communication and how both male and female politicians are acting in their official roles. The authors of this paper set out to use an experimental test to find whether gender schema affects perceptions of credibility of women in politics. They used a 2x2x3 experimental design for testing this theory using random assignment. They used the study research company Mechanical Turk in order to ensure a more diverse sample than a typical undergraduate sample. Many of us who research gender and politics are interested in how to answer these nuanced questions of how to understand gender stereotypes and how to increase women's representation in politics. So I'm glad to have some new research to that effect. So I have a few general questions, comments for your paper. I had a couple of specific suggestions for your literature review, and I can just send those to you two via email. So to start off, I was thinking about in your stimulus materials, you used the testimony of a cabinet level secretary and vary the name of the cabinet secretary and also have one that doesn't have a gender affiliation. And I think it would be helpful to the readers to understand why you're using a cabinet secretary for the stimulus instead of maybe an elected official. So do we expect different results for these two groups? So a cabinet secretary versus an elected official, could these two be used interchangeably? Is there a danger of someone envisioning a specific cabinet secretary? So I was thinking, and you showed this video just now, of Betsy DeVos. When I was thinking education secretary, Betsy DeVos automatically comes to my mind thinking about her saying these words because she's a really well-known figure. Also, unlike members of Congress, cabinet secretaries are more likely to be specialists in one issue area or subject area. So thinking about that sort of masculine coded issues, feminine coded issues, does that make your argument stronger or weaker? I think that's just maybe an area to talk about or address more in your paper. In your limitations section, you mentioned one potential drawback of your design is the use of text instead of video, and that video might have different implications. And I think this was my very first initial reaction on seeing some of your insignificant findings in your paper, was that difference between text and video and the way that stereotypes are often triggered. So is just seeing a woman's name in print different than actually seeing a woman and having those visual cues trigger these various stereotypes? So I actually think this would be a really interesting study too. If you're continuing on this work, having a study 1 and a study 2, or in the study 2, you used videos and we can say, okay, we see that just seeing a woman's name in text, that doesn't do much, but if people are watching this, they actually see a woman, are evaluating a woman by watching her, getting different results. I think that would be a really interesting addition to your study. Obviously, the archives are very visual. You could find some good examples to draw off of using the C-SPAN archives. We know from the political science literature that female politicians are much more likely to be judged on their appearance than male politicians are. So I think you're right in thinking that, okay, are there too many issues to control for here? But also just thinking about, is it really possible to trigger the same stereotypes just using a name in print? And my last comment is thinking about, your original question, which is why do we not have the same representation of women in politics as we would like to have? So ideally, 50% of women of people in Congress would be women, or state legislatures. We all know that we're still really far away from that. So I know you mentioned this briefly in your paper. Lawless and Fox tell us that one of the biggest differences that we see is really what we would call the ambition gap. So it's really not so much that women are running and they're not getting elected, but it's the fact that women aren't running in the first place. So we actually need to get more women to run for office in order to close that gap of the number of people who we need in elected office to be women. So I think it would be interesting. I don't know how you would want to approach this, but we need to start pretty early in convincing girls that it's good or possible to run for political office. Is there research using your gender schema theory that could address this question of the ambition gap? So like I said, I can send you some other more specific comments via email, but I really enjoyed reading your paper and I'm glad you shared it with us.